Hello all, and welcome to the Matt Powers Show, where we talk about all things nerd culture, from TV to movies to comic books and video games, to sports and music if we get around to it. I am, of course, your host, Matt Powers, a late-stage millennial doing what us millennials do best, making a podcast. Today I want to talk to you all about the current run of the XMen comics. Now, I've been a longtime fan of the XMen since I was like a preteen, and I've tried to follow in their adventures as I've gotten older. Personal issues with how Marvel presents its stories aside, I've had to kind of give up recently on the X-Men after I think it's a very dangerous and dramatic pivot in their storytelling. A pivot that's not only detrimental to the characters and stories of the X-Men, but it's also dangerous in our current world. Look, a few years ago, a writer by the name of Jonathan Hickman took up the reins of the X-Men franchise in an attempt to make the book new and fresh. In many ways, he rebooted the very concept of the X-Men with his debut storyline House of X and Powers of 10. In doing so, I feel like Hickman has taken away everything that I've loved about the X-Men, and kind of given us a time bomb waiting to go off. Let me explain. The X-Men have always been a group of outcast superheroes born into a class of people known as mutants who are, almost irrationally, hated and feared by the general public. This team trains to fight against other mutants who would use their powers for evil, targeting humanity. The X-Men fight against terrorism from mutants like Magneto, or would-be world-dominating mutants like Apocalypse. The sung-on mantra of the X-Men has always been, protecting a world which hates and fears them. But this is only one aspect of their appeal. The X-Men stand in for a real-world issue, prejudice. In the 60s and 70s, the allegory was that the X-Men were akin to the black leaders of the civil rights movement in America. Professor X, the leader of the X-Men, was compared to Martin Luther King Jr. Xavier believed in the peaceful coexistence between mutant and human, whereas Professor X's counterpart, Magneto, was a mutant terrorist who believed that the mutants to be superior. He was often compared to Malcolm X, the radical leader of the Black Panthers. Later, in the 90s and the 2000s, the X-Men would become stand-ins for the LGBTQ community. In this way, the X-Men remain relevant to the underclasses of society, fighting to gain acceptance from the world at large, and kind of hoping that they can one day overcome the hate and fear that permeates our world. This is one of the cornerstones of why I love the X-Men so much. They're just people, fighting for their place in the world. They represent the underdogs, those of us who don't fit perfectly into what is considered normal or correct in society. They were the team who believed in coexistence and peaceful change, an ideology which I stand behind to this very day. Then along comes Hickman. In an effort to rebrand the X-Men for a modern layout of media, and perhaps even to redesign them for their eventual introduction into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Hickman changes everything. He introduces a storyline wherein one of the X-Men's longtime allies, a human doctor named Moira McTaggart, is revealed to in fact be a mutant herself, with this ability to reincarnate at the end of her life, keeping all the memories of her previous lives with her. And Hickman outlines how she's lived many, many lives, each of them an attempt to bring peaceful coexistence between human and mutant. Unfortunately, none of it has worked. Until now. Until what we are to believe is the final timeline of her life. The X-Men are reintroduced to the world, now working alongside their most hated enemies, like Magneto, in the establishment of a mutant homeland known as Krakoa. The character of Professor X, again, who was all about the peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants, has changed dramatically. He no longer sees a future where humans and mutants live and work together harmoniously, but instead believes in the superiority of mutants over humans. Working alongside Magneto, again, who you should remember I said is a terrorist, and has always championed the destruction of mankind, Professor X now helps to build a future where mutants will not only surpass humanity, but dominate over them. A future where humanity will eventually disappear in exchange for mutant supremacy. This is a radical shift in tone for the X-Men as a group, and for the character like Professor X. It seems to me an admission from a modern-day writer that there is no way to coexist with people who hate and fear us. It's an attack against peace, and the peaceful fight against intolerance. In my mind, it undoes 50 years of stories where the allegory was meant to help bring down bigotry and racism in exchange for hope, and it actively targets anyone who disagrees with its rhetoric. It courts violence. It courts war. It's a dangerous message to send to the youth of today, and it destroys half a century of progress in finding common ground between different races and sexual orientations. Okay, maybe it's not that extreme. Maybe it's just a comic book, right? Fine, I'm willing to accept that. But it's a comic book that's always represented the best between the fight for acceptance. And now, it preaches the worst. It openly rejects peaceful coexistence as a cornerstone of ideology. And personally, I think that's a terrible position to take. Now, maybe it won't matter in the long run, but in the last 50 years, it's been a message that's inspired many people to try and find a way to work together. What will the new message be for those who have never read an X-Men comic before? What does it teach a new reader today? I appreciate what Hickman is trying to do. I appreciate he's trying to reinvigorate the brand, and I can see why people would find this comic very appealing. I can understand why those of us who have maybe been marginalized by society or feel like we have been walked over by a more dominating force would want the ability to stand up and demand that we are seen and heard over them. I get why, looking at this type of rhetoric, you would want these X-Men to win. But they have become the very villains that they've always stood against, and in doing so has changed the nature of what the X-Men are supposed to represent. I couldn't possibly stand here and begin to tell you what Stan Lee would have thought of this, but in my mind, I don't think he would have appreciated this kind of storytelling. Yes, it's a comic book, and we can always undo it. There are plenty of seeds that are in place that are even showing now that maybe the storyline is unraveling, and they'll somehow retcon it and go back to a more a previous version of how the X-Men used to be. But that's not the point. When you're writing about heroes, you want to keep them heroes as long as possible, because the minute you take away the heroism, that's the day that they become villains, and that's the day that you lose your faith in what the message is supposed to be about. We live in a tumultuous society. We live in a time where there are just too many things and factors fighting against one another. Harmony, coexistence, and peace need to be the things that we preach, the rhetoric that we talk about, and the cornerstones of our morality, if ever we're going to manage to get beyond the moments that we are in today. And the X-Men used to represent that. Unfortunately, at the moment, they don't. But the real question is, what do you think? Have you been a longtime reader like myself? Do you enjoy the X-Men comics? Are you reading all the books that are coming out now? What do you think of Hickman's changes in the timeline of the X-Men? Look, leave some comments below, let me know what you're thinking, or send me an email at davidcampproductions@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you, maybe discuss your comments on the next episode of the Matt Powers Show. If you like what you heard, you know the dance, click the like button and subscribe. It really helps me out, and I would really appreciate it. Guys, I appreciate you coming and watching these videos. I love you all. Thank you so much for watching today. And this is Matt Powers saying, Nerd out.